Mr. Silly. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as can be. In Nonsense Land, trees are red, the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? There it is, red tree, blue grass. In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forwards, they fly backwards. It's really a very silly place indeed, which of course is why Mr. Silly lives there. And there's a dog walking around with a hat. In fact, Mr. Silly lives in quite the silliest looking house you have ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier house looking than that? Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land, each year they hold a competition, and a cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night lying in bed, he dreams about winning it. There he is in bed dreaming about winning the cup. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realised that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. After that, he had a cornflake sandwich, and to finish, he had a boiled egg. But being silly, he ate it with the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? There he is, breakfast time. Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking about how to win the cup. He remembered 2 years ago, the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won by wallpapering his house, which sounds very ordinary, but in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of his house. See? Mr. Silly remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish was a friend of Mr. Silly, had won the cup for inventing a car. It was quite a normal car apart from one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? Mr. Silly thought and thought and thought, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. See, there he is, walking away, leaving the door open. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carried an umbrella? He said to the chicken. Meow, said the chicken, because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises they do in your country. There's a chicken with an umbrella and got the little Wellington boots on too. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a worm wearing a top hat, monocle, and an old school tie. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear a top hat, a monocle, and an old school tie? He said to the worm. Quack, quack, said the worm. There's the worm. Next, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat? He said to the pig. Moo, said the pig. Isn't that silly? It was in the middle of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea. Quite the silliest idea he'd ever had. He hurried into town, brought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. There he is, he's got paint and a paintbrush. The day of the great awarding of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The King of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the crowd in the city square, "it is my pleasure today to award the Nonsense Cup to whoever has the silliest idea of the year." There's the king. "One of the silliest ideas of the year," continued as the king, "is by Mr. Muddle the farmer. He has managed to grow, of all things, a square apple." The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everyone to see. He felt sure he was going to win. There's Mr. Muddle with the square apple. "However," the king said, and Mr. Muddle's face fell, "we have an even sillier idea entered by Mr. Nincompoop. It was a teapot, quite the silliest teapot there'd ever been." The crowd broke into a thunderous applause. "I therefore have great pleasure," announced the king, "to present the Nonsense Cup to—" Just then he looked up and stopped in astonishment. There's the Nonsense Teacup. Now, in the middle of the city square, there is a tree. It's always been there, and it was this tree that the kingdom was looking in astonishment. "What," he cried, "has happened to that tree?" Everyone turned to look. The tree had green leaves, bright green leaves, not red leaves like the other trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was an amazed silence. "It was me," piped up Mr. Silly. "I painted all the leaves green last night while you were all asleep." There's the tree looking like a tree. "A green tree!" exclaimed the king. "Who ever heard of a green tree?" "A green tree!" shouted the crowd. "How silly!" And they started applauding. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. "I think," he said, "that is the silliest idea I have ever heard of, and therefore I award the Nonsense Cup to Mr. Silly." The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. There he is, getting the cup. And a bird perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree looked down. "Woof," it said, and flew off backwards. The end. All right, sweetie, you have a good night's sleep tonight. Sweet dreams. Daddy loves you.